Hi friends. So there's much going on in the dog training atmosphere about e-collar stuff, and there's a big conversation around low-level activation stim versus higher aversive stim. And I don't feel compelled in any way, shape or form to add to the public discourse on that. I want to stay out of that, but I am getting like a lot of PMs and questions about how I feel in that space. So I want to just clarify my position on this, and I really want this to be taken as my position and what I do, not necessarily what is correct, not necessarily what someone else must do, and not necessarily in answer to the way somebody else does something. So this is happening between sessions. We're training with Jazz here. She's filming for me. We're not in the most ideal location for anything, but I feel like I can convey my intent. So here we go. So the issue around low-level activation stim and high-level aversive, or not high-level, but aversive level stim really comes down to a particular study done in the 1960s on rats, and I feel like that is the crux of all of this thing. And if you want to look up the study, it's called Resistance to Fear and Pain. I'll link it either in the description or somewhere. You'll find it, right? And you can go and check it out for yourself, but let me sort of give you the synopsis of it. The idea is we're looking at how can we stop these rats from doing something. So it's about aversives, right? And we want to stop. So the way it worked is there's these rats and they're in these alleys. So imagine, let's move this out of the way, we don't need it for yet. Imagine this is my little setup where between these parking space to there is the alley that can be electrified, all right? And what was done was the rats were trained to go and get a reinforcer at the end of the alley. 100 of these rats. And what they noted was that if we started stimming, the floor was electrified and the rat had to go to get it. And they wanted to find out how long, like what sort of level will it take to stop? When will that become aversive? And what was noted was that when they start stimming at a really low level, the rat just goes over it and gets to get his reinforcer, all right? And he gets it. So they go up a little bit, all right? And he goes back, and at a little bit more, maybe he notices it again, but he gets through it. And what happens is the rat keeps going through that ever increasing stim until we hit a point where you may have heard me explain before, and this is a line I stole from Bart, is that at some point the struggle, the pain, the consequence, the difficulty, the electric shock coming from the floor is too much that it outweighs the hope of the reinforcer that's at the end of it, right? So at some point, having gradually increased, the rat gets to the point where he steps onto here and goes, no, that's too much, I'm not doing it, right? And that's with that slow incremental increase. In that study, what they then found was that if you just went to a higher level to begin with, you can stop the rat at a lower level of what it would have taken if you grew gradually. So let's use made up numbers. Let's use numbers like 0 to 10. If we started the rat, because their numbers you'll read in the study are like actual amp output, you know, volts, whatever, which I'm not going to bore you with. If we start at level 1, the rat goes, I notice level 1, I don't care, I make it, I get my reinforcer. Then we go, okay, level 2. At level 2, maybe he does care, but he knows he can just get through it to get the reinforcer. At level 3, he knows, I got through 2, I'll get through 3. And maybe if we're capable of going to a level to 10, because the rat keeps going through the lower level to make it there, he then decides, I can take more. I got through the last one, I'll get through this one. I got through the last one, I'll get through this one. We're in a dog area, there's dogs barking, you'll have to deal with it, all right? So what ends up happening, let's say it takes level 8 out of 10 before eventually the rat steps on our electrified floor and goes, nah, too much, I can't take that. That level of pain is not worth going through in order to get that, and now we're into an aversive stim. Because the dog decided, that the rat decided not to go through here, right, he stops, and now I no longer need to, after enough repetitions and trials of that, I no longer need to have an electrified floor. In this context, the rat looks at it and goes, no, I'm not going to do it, it's aversively stimmed, and the behavior goes away, right? The behavior no longer expresses. If we never climb the levels, if we start at, say, a mid-range level, if we just, instead of going level 1, maybe we went to level 3 to start with, The rat steps on level 3 and goes, nah, not worth it, and steps back, right? So what they determine, and the outcome of the study, is that if you intend to use punishment, you're better off not having any loading phase. To be an aversive, it's better off just being straight aversive from the start and being aversive enough that the animal goes, no, I'm not going to do that. And if you're looking to stop something, it's probably better to risk being slightly too high than being too low, right? And that's the outcome of the study, and that is definitely something that is extremely relevant to us in dog training. But that's the outcome of the study when we're looking at it from this direction, where we're saying, okay, I don't want the dog, the rat, to get to the ball, right? I don't want that to happen. So if you're trying to aversively stim something, higher, earlier is better. And like I say, level 3 of my made up numbers would stop the untrained rat from getting to the reinforcer. But a rat who is trained that the electricity happens all the way till I get it, will take a much higher number, and let's say it's an 8. So ethics then tells us we're better off going to a higher level quicker without stuffing around in the lower levels to achieve the outcome. And in the long run, even though it was a higher level to begin with, the volume of electricity that our rat is going to get and the number of repetitions it's going to take to train that, which is a consideration as well, is going to be much less. But now let's think about it from a different point of view. We were trying to find a level that would be aversive. What if we were thinking about it from this direction, right? Where we think, okay, my rat already knows the behavior of running down this corridor and getting to his reinforcer. So he stands here, he already knows that because we had a learning phase like we did before, and he takes off going, and what he notices is that level 1, the floor is electrified, and he doesn't care. He notices it, but it's not enough to even put a dent in his stride, and he keeps going, and he grabs his reinforcer. And what he also notices is that when he got to this side, when the behavior is complete, getting the reinforcer, that the stim stopped, right? It's not negative reinforcement at this point because it didn't compel him to do anything. He was doing that anyway, but the stim accompanied him through till the behavior was complete. And that stim was at a level that he wasn't aversive, he didn't care, he just was aware of it. So same experiment, same thing's happening. Now we go to level 2, right? And now the rat starts, he gets his starting point, he feels it, and he thinks that is a pressure that I don't enjoy, it's annoying, I want to turn it off. But on the reps prior, when it was level 1, he learned exactly how to turn it off, right? So he runs faster and gets to the known behavior, grabs his reinforcer, and the electricity turns off. So what's likely to be observed in this time is that he's just going to go faster. And if we go up to another level, he's going to go faster again because he knows no matter how high those levels get within reason before it becomes aversive, the path to turning that off is known. All I need to do is get to the end here, and I get to not only turn off the pressure by getting to my reinforcer, I get the reinforcer. Okay, so we've been thinking about it prior about how do we stop the rat. In this case, we just think about how do we speed up the rat and how do we get the rat doing it more reliably and understanding that he turns off that pressure by completing the behavior. What we don't necessarily have to do is, we absolutely shouldn't do with a dog, is find the level that will cause him to quit, where the hope of getting to the end is less than the struggle of getting there, because then we're into that aversive stim level. And in fact, if it took level 8 of my made up numbers before and it was level 3 prior where it was like straight up aversive, if we know roughly those numbers or we can read that in the animal, we would stay well below that, but we want it to be enough that the rat, our dog, feels it, is compelled to turn it off, but also knows exactly how to do that. And that's by getting to the end, it turns off, he grabs his reinforcer. Cool. So there's There are ethics dilemmas in everything that we do in dog training, right? In everything that we do. There's people, we're here teaching dogs to man trail today, and there's people looking at us like we're savages because we've got dogs doing work, right? There's layers to everything. And whether you would want to do that, that's up to you. But I know that that's how it works, right? The low level stim at the lowest possible level, where I don't think we can even call it negative reinforcement at that point, creates a learning phase for our rat who learned the floor is no longer electrified when I get to here, right? Then when it is at a level that we can call negative reinforcement and it is a level that the rat does want to turn off, there will be much less stress and there will be a willingness to go through that in order to get to the end. Now, there's people that will talk about, you know, the endorphins and the dopamine and that kind of stuff. And like, I believe that that's probably true, right? So people who have worked hard to overcome things will tell you about that endorphin release of having gone through it. This is like the runner's high and that kind of stuff. If you've ever lifted weights, that kind of stuff, it fucking hurts, but the outcome at the end is very reinforcing and having gone through that difficulty. Maybe that exists here. If we want to talk about the possibility of dopamine existing in this space and why we might see a surge in dopamine because of it, is because eventually we get to this, the variable schedule of the negative reinforcement pushing to here. So imagine let's talk dogs now, let's stop talking rats. And our dog's job is just to get that ball in his mouth. And he feels his stim, I've got my horn, he feels his stim that pushes him into it, and he learns to go faster, and it's a guarantee in his mind that the faster he goes, the less stim he feels, the quicker it turns off, the quicker he gets the reinforcer. And again, we acknowledge at this point we are using negative reinforcement, we're pushing him into it because we're still learning, right? And this doesn't take a lot of time. This isn't something you'd be doing with the dog for its whole life. This is a few sessions, we're building this, you know, repertoire. And then one day, you send the dog to go get the ball, and across this floor on the way, we don't stim, right? So imagine we get there and the dog believes that he beat it, right? The other thing we should do probably before that is we should also use that activation stim. This is where people get that activation. So the stim that accompanies the command, right? So the dog feels that and goes like, oh yeah, I know how to turn that off by getting to there. The day we don't do it, the dog thinks he beat it, right? He thinks that he was so fast in his action at the command that he beat the stim off of the launch point to get to the behavior. Now, that's where we can talk about variable and dopamine, because now there's variance in it, and we're into, even though the studies on dopamine that we'll look at, you know, when we talk, like Robert Sapolsky's study, that's done with positive reinforcement. We think probably that works with negative reinforcement. That may well all be factual, but that kind of puts us in this mindset of very technical and a little bit overly scientific, though we must be scientific. What you can do is at those low levels, when we are annoying the dog, we can move into the game of him having beat it, right? So it can be every now and again, if he's not fast enough, we nick him and he goes, oh, you got me, right? And there's times where if the dog knows it's coming from us, and especially, this is where it becomes interesting because that pressure doesn't always have to be an e-collar. We're talking about it in terms of e-collars, but it could be the prong collar, it could be anything. And the prong collar, people understand it better because it's physical, like the dog really can beat your ability to prong him forward to get it. But with the e-collar, you have to be the player of the game, and that tap that acts as a reinforcer of the command, bam, go get it. Sometimes the dog beats it and that's a point for him, and sometimes he doesn't beat it and that's a point for you, right? Now, so both methods are going to work, but one's going to start something and the other's going to stop something. If you want to use an e-collar to do both of those things, now we're into some tricky territory, because anyone that wants to talk about how we should be avoiding the incremental increases to use as an aversive is absolutely correct. And anybody who will say that we can use those incremental increases to increase speed, power, reliability is also correct. It's where those two things meet in the middle that becomes kind of tricky and problematic, right? So first of all, I want to talk about the reliability piece that this gives us in the form of a correction rather than an aversive. So an aversive, as we talked about before, that's going to stop the dog getting here. And that correction is going to make the dog get here. So imagine we're at that variable schedule and I tell my dog to go get the ball from over there, and inside this space, he's like where he's performing the behavior, before the behavior is complete, he gets distracted or chooses not to. Or even worse still, here he just chooses not to do the behavior. At that point, my stim is not an aversive that would stop him doing anything. It is a correction, it is still negative reinforcement at that point, that starts him going into the behavior that we wanted to happen. And that gives us the ability to, on the spot, make the behavior that we needed to happen, that the dog knows and for whatever reason chose not to, happen. And there's people, like pet people that are calling their dog back and it's going to get hit by a car. This is why it'll work. There's people whose lives depend on their dog doing the job in that moment. And that's why we need a mechanism to say, hey, there's issues with my training, the motivation's not there, you're externally motivated, there's other reasons that this is happening, but here, now, in this moment, I can activate you into that behavior with that stim. And because of the learning phase that happened in this single behavior, where the dog has to go through the stim to get to what he wanted, he knows that if he chooses not to do it, that stim will start him doing it. The blurry line is when people think that you're giving the dog an aversive for disobedience, which you can do, but you are not doing that in this space. You are activating the dog into it. Is that stim aversive? Of course, it can be. It is something the dog wants to turn off, but he turns it off by doing, not by not doing. Okay, so that's a lot of information. We've got to talk about where these two things meet, all right? If you want to use the e-collar straight as an aversive tool, you absolutely can do that. I'm not going to tell anyone why they should do anything, but you must not do this section of slowly incrementing and showing that learning phase of how to turn it off. If you want it to be purely aversive, you've got to go to a level right away that will be aversive. If you want to use it as an activation and drive the dog into the behavior, the hope, the reinforcer that completing the behavior must be more than the hope must be less than the struggle to go through the level of stim to get to there. If it becomes too much, you'll make it an aversive. And there is no rush, there is no prizes for being able to activate your dog with a higher level. The thing with the e-collar especially, but pressure in all forms, is that it's cumulative. It gets stronger and more powerful over time without even going up in levels. And so what we can show the dog when we're using leashes and that kind of thing, and leashes are about to become important when we talk in a minute, is that if we go to here and he stops and he's just riding it out, I don't necessarily need to go up in levels. What I need to do is show the dog the inevitability of it. It stays on until the behavior is complete. And he knows the behavior at that point. If he doesn't know the behavior, you're doing the wrong thing. And if he needs help to complete the behavior, this is why e-collars need to be used often in conjunction with leashes and other tools so that we can be sure that the actual behavior that we want to happen is really gonna happen. So, imagine we've done this loading phase and now we want to use the e-collar as an aversive. We have to acknowledge that, yeah, likely we have to use a slightly higher level. But in my experience, that level actually doesn't end up being higher than we probably would have used anyway, right? Because noting that if we're trying to stop something, especially something that the dog is on his way to get, it needs to be a level where that will happen. And if we were to say, take a stab in the dark and say, let's use level 3, because we're not going to use 1, we're not going to use 2, we're going to go to 3 because we want the behavior to stop, and 3 wasn't enough, and the dog does it, you may as well be back in the other model. So if you're going to use an aversive stim, the stim level has to be enough to be an aversive, and if it's the first time you're doing it, you're taking a guess at that point. So it's been my experience that you can still do it, but you do have to make a big jump in level. But I don't think that that big jump in level is more than you probably should have just done in the first place with the other. That is only true if you are not intentionally trying your best to climb the levels and see what the dog will go through. Because the truth is, I've seen this plenty of times, is that the dog can get to the highest level and you lose the ability to use the e-collar as an aversive stim. There are dogs that can do that, and if the increments of increase are small enough, the dog will get through it. Especially when you're talking a collar that has 100 levels, right? If you go up one by one, the dog goes, all right, I got through that, I'll get through the other. So the big jump is important, right, to make it aversive. The other part is if you don't want to use the big jump, then this is where your leash plays in, right? Because if the dog's on his way to do something you don't want him to do, and you're worried that your stim will activate him to do it harder, better, whatever, that's where you need to be in a point of being able to physically stop the dog, keep the stim on until the dog realizes, I can't do this. He tries, and when he stops trying, you take off the stim. But we acknowledge maybe that's not as aversive as we think. Maybe that is activation into not doing. Like whatever the dog did that turned off the stim, if you've programmed the dog that way, he probably thinks that he did something specific that turned off the stim, not getting that, right? So it leaves us in this trouble. I like this method. I think that it provides clarity to the dog. I think that on his way here, when we go into a complex behavior, the dog knows I'm incorrect because I feel the stim. And I use that super low level where, like level 1, level 2, where he's not freaked out about it, but he knows this is guidance to continue, right? And then the moment he does the behavior, the stim turns off. Because in reality, when we do this, it's more like this. The stim turns off when he gets there, then we have the behavior happening, and then I use the positive reinforcement to pull the dog out of the behavior. And it gives us options of this, right? So one day the behavior is now get the ball, but the dog doesn't know whether the ball's there or not. And if we drive him into it and he gets there and the ball doesn't come, then maybe in the future, we try and send him to do it and he goes, no, I don't believe that the ball could be there. And if in that moment and the ball isn't there because this is a live track or whatever, if the motivation is no longer there, we can use that motivation to make it happen. People who say that you can just do that and without the loading phase, stim the dog when he's not working and push him to work, that can be true, that can happen, but what's happening in that moment is you are punishing disobedience and you're hoping that the dog then gets back to obedience, right? In this instance, we are telling the dog that stim will turn off when you perform the specific behavior rather than punishing the dog for not doing the specific behavior and hoping that his next choice is to do the specific behavior. So there's no right or wrong way to do it, right? There's considerations if you want to do it one way, there's considerations if you want to do it another way. What I will say for sure is that if you're using this e-collar as an activation signal, and what gets more complex, and for you guys that are watching this, you have access to the video on like the staying in behavior video. What's more complex is if you've done that part as well with the stim, is if you have an issue that you want to aversively stim away, aversively stop, that exists within a behavior that you do want the dog to do. So here's an example. Imagine your dog is in a down. You've done the low level activation stim, right? And you've used high level stim to aversively stop other things, right? And it would be a high level. If the dog starts creeping forward in the down, a low level stim at that point will likely make him creep more in the down. You're gonna make it worse. And a high level stim at that point would likely make the down aversive. So you're kind of trapped at that point, right? So the e-collar is not a tool that can fix that for you if you're in that model of both. In that instance, you're gonna have to go for more of a prong collar, a physical thing, probably a flat collar. You're gonna have to isolate the dog back into him, put him back into that position, and then you could provide feedback that he did the wrong thing and make it aversive so that he doesn't want to do it again and therefore chooses not to do that behavior. So it's a lot of me talking, but what I'm trying to convey is that there's no right or wrong way. There's no way that's better and there's no way that's worse. There's just considerations for each. You can't have it all, right? Every strength in one place creates a weakness somewhere else. And if you're aware of that and play the strength that you have and then note the weaknesses and find a strength from somewhere else to fill the gap of the weakness you've created, then you're killing it. You're fine. It's when you just think that your answer is the only way that you can get trapped, because it's not the only way. There's multiple ways of doing it. I think that's it. Have I missed anything, Jess? She's shaking her head at me. I'll remember more after we stop filming from this. Truth is, One of the things we're gonna do with these puppies that we've got 3 of them in the fucking car, is when they're old enough, you can hear them barking, when they're old enough, we're gonna do this for realsies, and we're gonna show this whole system, and it's gonna be an e-collar thing that we sell. I'm not making a pitch because I just fucking laid the whole lot out to you, but if you wanna see it really done, and the specifics of how it's done, that's coming, probably not till the end of the year will it be ready. But this is my take on it. Again, what I just wanna reiterate is, like, I'm not interested in a argument with anybody else about the right way, the wrong way, anything like that. This is just the only reason I made this video and I'm giving it to you guys is because I'm getting dozens of PMs every day asking to give my take on it. And I think that there's enough fractions in the dog training world. I'm not interested in causing any more or picking a side in any of the ones that exist. My team is the team of people who are ethical in their training, do it for the good of the dogs, and are effective. And everybody that's involved in this, in my opinion, is all those things. So that's my take. Goodbye.